Far past the edge of the Kesson belt, where the stars grew thin and the dust of a dead world still drifted in slow circles, a small gray scout ship sat with its engines cold. Its pilot, a young Skarn named Rule Ven, watched a single blip on his screen and did not move. He had been watching it for 6 hours. The blip was not fast. It was not clever. It did not zigzag or hide behind debris the way a smart ship would. It simply moved forward, in a straight line, at a speed that a cargo hauler would have been ashamed of, and yet Rule Ven's hands would not stop shaking. "Command, this is Scout 7, he said into his comm, keeping his voice as steady as he could. "I have visual and sensor lock on the target. Confirmed. It is the human ship." There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice, older and rougher than his own, answered. "Which one?" "The big one," Rule said. "The slow one, the one they call the Patience." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Rule said. "I have never seen anything like it. It is not shaped like a warship. It is shaped like a mountain, someone carved into a box, and then bolted engines to the back of it. It has no grace at all. It moves like it does not care that anyone is watching." "Stay back," the voice said. "Do not get close. Do not let it see you." "Command, I do not think it needs to see me to know I am here." The voice on the other end did not answer that. Rule Ven sat in his cold little scout ship and watched the gray mountain drift through the dark, and he understood, in the way that a small animal understands the shadow of a much larger one passing overhead, that he was looking at something that did not belong to the same category of thing as his own ship. It was not a faster predator or a stronger predator. It was something else, something that did not need to hunt, because everything eventually walked into its path anyway. The Skarn were not a people who scared easily. This was a fact they were proud of, and a fact that was mostly true. They had fought 3 wars against the Tauran Assembly, and won 2 of them. They had raided the outer colonies of a dozen smaller species and never once needed to apologize for it. Their ships were fast, their pilots were reckless, and their commanders believed, as a matter of simple pride, that speed and aggression could solve almost any problem that presented itself in open space. So when Fleet Commander Dessa Vral received the report from Scout 7, she did not feel fear. She felt something closer to irritation, and underneath the irritation, a small, cold seed of doubt that she did not like at all. She had heard of the ship before. Everyone in the outer systems had heard of it, the way everyone has heard some old story about a haunted stretch of road or a house nobody will buy. The humans called it the Patience, though nobody was entirely sure if that was its real name or just what the crews who feared it had started calling it. It was slow, painfully, almost insultingly slow. It could not outrun a supply barge. It took whole days to change its heading. Its engines, from what anyone could tell, produced barely enough thrust to justify the mass of the hull they were dragging through space. And yet, Dessa Vral had counted, over the last decade, at least 11 ships and small fleets that had gone looking for that mountain of gray metal, certain that its slowness made it an easy kill. Pirates, raiders. Once, an entire strike group from a species called the Orn Compact, who had a reputation for being nearly as aggressive as the Skarn themselves. 11 groups had gone looking for the Patience. None of them had ever been heard from again. That was the part that bothered her, not that the ship had won. Ships won battles all the time. What bothered her was that there were no survivors to tell the story, no wreckage reports, no distress calls cut short, no black boxes recovered years later drifting in the dark. The ships that went to find the Patience simply stopped existing, as completely and quietly as if they had never been built at all. "Bring the fleet in," she said. "Slow, no provoking. I want eyes on it, nothing more." The Patience did not know it was being watched, or if it did, it gave no sign of caring. Aboard the ship, in a control room that was larger than most planetary command centers and lit by a soft amber light that never seemed to flicker, Captain Elena Marsh sat in a chair that had been designed, decades ago, by engineers who assumed a captain might need to sit in it for 16 hours at a stretch without complaint. She was not a young woman. She had commanded the Patience for 11 years, and before that she had served as its first officer for 9, and before that, She had been a junior engineer working on the drive systems when the ship was still being built in orbit above a planet most of her current crew had never visited. She was reading a report on grain shipments to the perimeter colonies when her sensor officer, a broad-shouldered man named Tomas Ruiz, cleared his throat. "Captain, we have company." "How many?" 41 ships. Skarn configuration, based on the drive signatures. They are keeping their distance. About 2 light minutes out, shadowing our course. Elena Marsh set down the report. She did not stand up. She did not raise her voice. "Are they hostile?" "Not yet. Just watching." "Then let them watch." She looked at the report again, then set it aside entirely. "Signal engineering. Tell them to run the quarterly diagnostic on the forward plating, while we have a quiet moment. No sense letting good time go to waste." Ruiz allowed himself a small smile before turning back to his console. This was the thing that new crew members always found strange about serving on the Patience, and the thing that old crew members eventually grew to find comforting. The ship did not rush. It did not panic. 41 warships could sit at its flank for a week, and the captain would use the time to schedule maintenance. It was not that the crew did not take threats seriously. It was that they had been trained, from their very first day aboard, to understand a simple truth about their ship. It was built to survive being watched. It was built to survive being followed, provoked, tested, and eventually attacked by people who assumed its slowness meant weakness. The training doctrine had a phrase for it, one that every cadet learned before they were allowed to touch a single control panel. "Let them come. We will still be here when they are gone." 3 days passed. The Skarn fleet kept its distance, gathering sensor data, running its own quiet calculations. Rule Ven, still flying his small scout ship at the edge of the formation, found himself assigned to a rotation of pilots, whose job was simply to watch the Gray Mountain and report anything unusual. Nothing unusual happened. The ship moved forward. It changed heading exactly once, a slow and unhurried turn that took the better part of 6 hours to complete, adjusting its course by perhaps 10 degrees to avoid a scattered field of ice debris that its own scanners must have flagged as a minor inconvenience rather than a threat. It did not power up any weapons that Skarn's sensors could detect. It did not send out any drones or fighters. It simply continued on its way, like a very large, very patient animal walking through a forest full of smaller animals who had not yet decided whether to attack it or run. On the 4th day, a young Skarn pilot named Torv Hessek decided he had seen enough. Torv was not a coward, and he was not stupid, not exactly. He was ambitious, and he was 26 years old, and he had grown up on stories of Skarn glory that made heroes out of pilots who took risks nobody else was willing to take. He had watched the gray ship for 4 days and seen nothing that frightened him. No weapons fire, no fighters, no drones. Just a slow, ugly hulk of metal that could not even be bothered to speed up when a hostile fleet arrived at its flank. He broke formation without authorization. His small fighter, fast and sleek and built for exactly this kind of maneuver, streaked forward, closing the distance to the Patience in a matter of minutes. He did not fire. He told himself, later, when Fleet Commander Vrall demanded to know what in the void he thought he was doing, that he had only wanted to get close enough to take a real scan, close enough to see if the stories were true, or if the humans had simply gotten lucky 11 times in a row. He got close enough to see the hull in detail for the first time. Up close, it was even less impressive than it looked from a distance. The plating was dull and scarred, patched in places with metal that did not quite match the color of the rest. There were no elegant lines, no aggressive angles designed to look intimidating. It looked, if anything, like something that had been built to be practical rather than beautiful, the way a bunker is practical rather than beautiful. And then, without any warning that his sensors could detect, without any visible change in the ship's speed or heading, a single-point defense turret on the ship's flank rotated exactly 40 degrees and put a single round through the front third of his fighter. He did not have time to scream. His ship became a rapidly expanding cloud of debris and frozen atmosphere, and the Patience did not so much as adjust its course. The turret rotated back to its resting position. The ship continued forward, at the exact same slow, unhurried pace it had been holding for 4 days. On the bridge of Fleet Commander Vrall's flagship, there was a long silence. Confirm status of pilot Hessick, Vrall said, though she already knew the answer. No status to confirm, Commander. There's nothing left. How long was he inside their engagement range before they fired? The sensor officer checked his readings twice before answering, because the number did not seem correct the first time he calculated it. 11 seconds, Commander. 11 seconds. And they were tracking him the entire time? It does not appear so. There's no record of a targeting lock, no warning ping, no active scan directed at his fighter specifically. It's as though the turret was already aimed at the exact point where his ship would be, before he had even finished his approach vector. Vrall felt the cold seed of doubt in her chest grow into something larger and colder. That is not possible. No targeting system predicts a pilot's flight path with that kind of precision, not against an experienced pilot making evasive adjustments. No, Commander, it shouldn't be possible. She stared at the tactical display, at the small red marker where Torv Hessick's fighter had been a few minutes earlier, and she thought about the 11 fleets that had gone looking for the patients and never come home. Pull the fleet back, she said quietly. Full retreat. 2 light hours, minimum. Nobody gets close to that ship again without my direct order. Commander, that's a significant withdrawal. Command will want an explanation. Tell them, Vrall said, that we found the ship. Tell them it is exactly as slow as the stories say. And tell them that it does not need to be fast. Aboard the Patience, in the control room lit by its steady amber light, Captain Elena Marsh had watched the entire encounter on her own screens without changing her expression. When the young pilot's fighter had gotten close enough to trigger the automated point defense response, she had simply nodded once, the way a person nods when a weather forecast turns out to be correct. Casualties? She asked, though it was a formality she already knew. 1 fighter, 1 pilot, Ruiz reported. No damage to us. Point defense grid handled it without needing manual authorization. Log it. Standard report to Fleet Command. Low priority. Note that a hostile fighter approached within engagement range and was neutralized by automated defenses. No further action required. Yes, Captain. Elena Marsh looked at the tactical display, at the small cluster of 40 Skarn ships, now pulling back into the darkness, putting more and more distance between themselves and her ship with every passing hour. She felt no satisfaction in what had happened. She felt, if anything, a kind of tired familiarity, the same feeling a teacher might have watching a student make the same mistake that every student before them had also made. They'll pull all the way back, she said, mostly to herself. They'll spend a few weeks deciding whether we got lucky or whether the stories are real. Then they'll either leave us alone, or someone ambitious will convince their command that they can do better than the others did. You think they'll come back? Ruiz asked. They always come back, Elena said. Everyone thinks they'll be the ones who figure out our trick. Everyone thinks the ones before them just weren't clever enough, or brave enough, or patient enough. Will they figure it out? Elena Marsh looked at the amber lights of her own bridge, at the crew who worked calmly and quietly around her, none of them rushing, none of them panicking, all of them simply doing their jobs the way they had been trained to do them, the way this ship had been designed, from its very first bolt, to be operated. No, she said, they won't, and that's exactly the problem for them. The ship continued forward, slow and steady, and utterly unhurried, deeper into the dark, carrying its secrets the way it always had, quietly, patiently, and without the slightest interest in proving anything to anyone who was not already aboard. Roel Venn did not sleep well that night, or the night after. He had watched Torv Hessick's fighter break apart on his own screen, close enough that the flash of it had briefly overloaded one of his sensor feeds, and he found that the image would not leave him, no matter how many times he tried to focus on something else. He was not close friends with Torv. They had trained together, years earlier, in the same officer program, and they had shared drinks a handful of times at the same stations, the way pilots in the same fleet often did. But Torv had been alive one moment, full of the same reckless confidence that most young Skarn pilots carried like a badge of honor, and then he had simply stopped existing, so quickly and so completely, that Roel found it difficult to believe the universe allowed such things to happen without at least some pause, some warning, some moment where the rest of reality noticed that something enormous had just occurred. The rest of reality had not noticed at all. The patients had continued forward at the exact same speed. The stars had not dimmed. Nothing about the vast, silent dark surrounding both fleets had shifted in any way to mark the fact that a young man with a family and a future had simply ceased to be. "You did the right thing, staying in formation," his flight commander told him. During the debrief that followed, a lot of pilots would have wanted to break off and try something reckless after watching that. Retaliate, prove a point, something foolish. You held position and reported clean data. That matters. "It doesn't feel like it matters," Rule admitted. "It will," the commander said. "Give it time." Fleet Commander Vral spent the long, slow retreat back toward Skarn territory, reviewing every scrap of sensor data her fleet had gathered over 4 days of shadowing the patients, searching for anything, any detail at all, that might explain what she had witnessed. She found very little that satisfied her. The ship's hull composition was unusual, thicker than anything in the Skarn's own shipbuilding tradition, but not so exotic that it defied explanation entirely. The engines were, if anything, disappointingly ordinary, generating barely enough thrust to explain the ship's already sluggish acceleration. There was nothing in the raw data that explained the 11-second kill, nothing that explained why a single-point defense turret had rotated to exactly the correct angle to intercept a fast-moving fighter without any detectable targeting sequence beforehand. "It shouldn't be possible," she said again, alone in her quarters, staring at the same sensor logs she had already reviewed a dozen times. Nothing reacts that precisely without tracking first. And yet the data did not lie, and the data agreed with itself every time she checked it. Whatever the patients' automated defenses were doing, they were not doing it in a way that any Skarn engineer, or any engineer from any species Vral had ever studied, would recognize as a normal targeting process. She thought, for the first time in a long career built on speed and aggression, and the comfortable certainty that came from commanding fast, well-trained pilots, that perhaps she had encountered something that could not be understood through combat alone. Perhaps it needed to be studied instead, the way a scholar studies a difficult text rather than the way a warrior studies an opponent. The thought unsettled her more than the death of Torv Hessek had, though she could not at first entirely explain why. By the time the fleet reached the relative safety of Skarn border space, word of the encounter had already begun to travel ahead of them, carried by encrypted burst transmissions sent from outlying scout posts to Fleet Command's central archive. The story grew a little with each retelling, the way stories always did among pilots eager to make sense of something frightening by wrapping it in language they understood. Some said the patients had fired without any warning at all, a cold-blooded execution of a pilot who had done nothing more than fly too close. Others said Torv Hessek had been reckless beyond reason, that any sane pilot would have known better than to approach a ship with that kind of reputation, and that his death, while regrettable, had been entirely his own doing. Both versions were, in their own way, partially true, and both versions missed the detail that troubled Vral the most: the sheer, unbothered calm with which the ship had continued on its course afterward, as though killing an approaching fighter required no more attention or effort than adjusting a minor course correction. She filed her official report that evening, keeping her language carefully measured, careful not to overstate what she had witnessed, while also refusing to understate it, simply to spare herself the discomfort of admitting how little she understood. The final line of her report would, in time, become one of the more frequently quoted phrases in Skarn Fleet Command's growing internal file on Patience-class vessels. Recommend no further engagement without significant additional intelligence. This is not a target. It is a puzzle, and I do not yet understand the shape of it. To understand the Patience, a person first had to understand what had happened to Earth, a little over 60 years before Torv Hessek flew his fighter too close to its hull. It was not a story humans like to tell often, and it was not a story they told the same way twice, because the truth of it was simple and painful, and did not need much decoration. Humanity had reached the stars the way a child reaches for a hot stove, with curiosity and no understanding of what it might cost them. They had built their first generation of warp-capable ships, sent them out past the edge of the solar system, and made contact with their first alien civilization within a decade. That civilization had not been friendly. The species called themselves the Corvi, and they were not cruel so much as they were practical, in the same way a farmer is practical about which animals get to live and which get turned into food. They had looked at humanity's young, undefended colonies scattered across 3 neighboring systems, and they had decided that Earth's resources and territory were worth more than Earth's people. The attack came without warning, without a declaration, without any of the ceremony that humans had assumed, in their naivety, that interstellar war would come wrapped in. 4 colonies were destroyed in the opening weeks. Not conquered, destroyed, the populations scattered or killed, the infrastructure burned down to bedrock so that nothing useful would be left behind for whoever survived. Earth itself came under a blockade that lasted 11 months, a slow strangling of trade and supply lines that killed more people through starvation and shortage than the initial attacks had killed through violence. Humanity survived, barely. It survived because Earth's remaining shipyards produced a desperate, ugly, badly coordinated defense fleet that fought the Corvi to a standstill through sheer stubbornness rather than skill, and because the Corvi, in the end, decided that the cost of finishing the job was higher than the value of what remained to be taken. They withdrew. They did not apologize, and they did not offer terms. They simply left, the way a predator leaves a wounded animal that has turned out to have more fight in it than expected, judging that easier meals existed elsewhere. Earth's government convened what later became known as the Reckoning Council, a group of admirals, engineers, and survivors tasked with a single question: how does humanity make sure this never happens again? The answer that emerged from that council took 8 years to fully articulate, and another 20 to build. It was not the answer most people expected. Admiral Beatrice Solano, who chaired the Reckoning Council for its first 6 years, was fond of a particular saying that eventually found its way into official fleet doctrine, printed on plaques in shipyards and academies across every human colony. The saying was simple: we cannot outrace the wolves, so we will become the mountain instead. The logic behind it was cold and clear-eyed, born from watching the Corvi War unfold in painful detail. Humanity had tried to build fast, agile ships to match the speed and aggression of species who had been fighting interstellar wars for centuries longer than humans had even had spaceflight. It had not worked. Human pilots, however brave, could not outfly opponents who had grown up in cockpits their whole lives. Human ships, however cleverly designed, could not outmaneuver fleets who had refined their combat doctrine over dozens of generations. So the Council proposed something different. Instead of trying to win wars through speed, agility, and clever tactics, humanity would build ships that did not need any of those things. Ships so heavily armored that speed became irrelevant, because nothing could hurt them quickly enough to matter. Ships so redundantly built that any single system, or 10 systems, or 50 systems could fail completely, and the ship would keep fighting anyway. Ships that did not try to dodge, because dodging assumed you could be hit hard enough to need to. It was, by the standards of most other species, an almost insulting way to build a warship. It ignored elegance entirely. It ignored the entire tradition of naval combat that most interstellar civilizations had inherited from centuries of refining speed, maneuverability, and precision. Human engineers were told quite directly, by more than one alien contact in those early years, that they were building something closer to a moving asteroid than a proper warship. The engineers did not argue with that description. They rather liked it. The first of the new class of ships was called the UES Bedrock, and it was, by every measure that mattered to its designers, a monster. It was not fast. It could barely outrun a fully loaded ore freighter. Its turning radius was measured in hours rather than minutes, but its hull plating was thicker than anything any other species had ever put on a ship of comparable size, layered in a design that spread the force of any impact across the entire structure, rather than concentrating damage at a single point. Its internal systems were triplicated, sometimes quintuplicated, so that a hit which would cripple another ship's engines or weapons or life support would leave the Bedrock's own systems fully operational, simply routed through a backup that had been sitting idle and waiting for exactly this moment. Most importantly, its weapons were designed around a different philosophy entirely. Rather than trying to outshoot faster ships in a quick exchange of fire, the Bedrock's weapon systems were built for patience. Long-range guns that took time to charge but hit with devastating force. Point defense grids that did not need a human hand on the trigger, because no human reaction time could match the speed required to intercept incoming fire, and so the systems were built to calculate and fire on their own. faster and more precisely than any pilot could manage. The bedrock was tested for the first time not against the Corvi, who had retreated to their own territory and shown no immediate interest in returning, but against a group of pirates who had been raiding human supply lines along the outer colonies for 2 years without serious opposition. The pirates, flying a mismatched fleet of fast raiders, saw the lumbering new human ship and did exactly what pirates in fast ships tend to do when they see something slow and alone. They attacked. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, 11 pirate ships had been destroyed, and the bedrock had sustained damage to its outer plating that its own crew described, afterward, as cosmetic. Not one system had failed. Not one crew member had been seriously injured. Word of the engagement spread slowly at first, the way most things did in the vast, quiet distances between star systems, but it spread. And as more ships of the same design were built, each one slightly refined based on lessons learned from the last, a pattern began to emerge that other species found difficult to understand and even more difficult to counter. The Patience was the 7th ship of its class, built 11 years after the bedrock, incorporating every lesson learned from 6 previous engagements that had each, in their own way, tested a different weakness and found the ship's design equal to the challenge. By the time it was launched, human engineers had stopped thinking of these ships as experiments and started thinking of them as a settled doctrine, a permanent answer to a question that had once nearly ended their species. Captain Elena Marsh had not commanded the Patience from its launch. She had been a junior engineer on its construction crew, one of hundreds of specialists who spent 4 years in orbital shipyards fitting together a hull that would eventually stretch longer than some of the largest structures ever built by human hands. She remembered, even now, more than a decade later, the strange feeling of standing inside one of the ship's armor plates before it was welded into place, a single piece of metal, thick enough that she could not see her own hand on the other side of it. "It feels like building a coffin," one of her fellow engineers had said to her once, only half joking, during a long shift deep in the ship's hull. "No," she had told him, because even then, young and uncertain of her own opinions, she had understood something about the philosophy behind what they were building. "It feels like building a promise that nobody gets to do to us again what the Corvi did." She had been right, though it had taken years for the rest of the galaxy to understand it the way she did. The doctrine that governed how ships like the Patience operated was not simply about armor and weapons. It was about patience itself, in every sense of the word. Crews were trained, from their very first day of service, to never rush a decision, never panic under fire, and never assume that speed was the correct response to a threat. The ship's own combat computer, a sprawling and deeply redundant system that had been refined across 7 generations of the ship class, was built around a similar philosophy. Rather than reacting instantly and imperfectly to every threat, it was designed to observe, calculate, and respond with overwhelming precision, even if that meant a slightly longer delay before the response came. This was the secret, if it could even be called a secret, behind what had happened to Torv Hessek and the 10 other groups before him who had tested the Patience and never returned. The ship's automated defenses did not need to track a fast-moving fighter in real time, constantly adjusting and predicting where the pilot might go next. Instead, they calculated, well in advance, the full range of positions a fighter could realistically occupy given its speed, its angle of approach, and the limits of its own maneuverability, and they simply waited for the fighter to arrive somewhere within that calculated range. It did not matter how skilled the pilot was, or how unpredictable they tried to be, because the ship was not trying to predict their exact choices. It was simply waiting for physics to run its course. Elena Marsh had explained this once, early in her command, to a young officer who had asked her how the ship's point defense grid always seemed to know exactly where an incoming threat would be. "It doesn't know," she had said. "It doesn't need to know. It just needs to be patient enough to let the enemy make their own mistake, and precise enough to be ready when they do." That philosophy, extended outward from a single-point defense turret to the entire strategic doctrine of the ship, was the true reason no fleet had ever successfully challenged the Patience. Fast, aggressive fleets like the Skarn were used to fighting battles that rewarded speed, initiative, and bold decision-making. They were used to opponents who could be pressured into mistakes, provoked into overextending, tricked into revealing weaknesses that a clever attacker could then exploit. The patience did not make mistakes born of pressure, because it refused to feel pressured in the first place. It did not overextend, because it never needed to reach further than its own overwhelming defenses already covered, and it had no weaknesses to exploit that a faster, more aggressive attack could reach, before the ship's own systems simply, patiently, and inevitably closed the distance instead. Word of the encounter with the Skarn scouting fleet reached Fleet Command roughly 2 weeks after it happened, filed as a low-priority incident report, exactly as Elena Marsh had ordered. It would likely have been filed away and forgotten, one more small footnote in the growing legend of the patience, if not for a single detail that caught the attention of a junior intelligence officer reviewing incoming reports from the perimeter sector. The officer, a sharp and somewhat obsessive analyst named David Achebe, noticed that the Skarn fleet involved in the incident had not simply retreated and dispersed the way most groups did after a failed test of the patience's defenses. Instead, sensor logs showed the fleet holding position at a distance of just over 2 light hours for nearly 3 full weeks, apparently gathering long-range data before finally withdrawing toward what fleet intelligence identified as Skarn territory. That was unusual. Most species who tested the patience and lost either withdrew immediately, unwilling to risk further losses, or escalated quickly, sending a larger force to try again before the humans could adjust their tactics. Sitting quietly at a distance for 3 weeks, gathering data without attacking, suggested something else entirely, a species trying to genuinely understand what they were dealing with, rather than simply reacting to it. Achebe flagged the report for further review and attached a short note that would later be read by several senior officers, including, eventually, Elena Marsh herself. Recommend increased monitoring of Skarn fleet movements in the perimeter sector. Pattern of behavior suggests they may be planning a more calculated response, rather than a simple retaliatory strike. Request permission to open a dedicated intelligence file on Skarn command structure and decision-making patterns. The permission was granted within the week. It would take much longer, however, for anyone on the human side to fully understand exactly how right David Achebe's instincts had been, or exactly what kind of calculated response the Skarn Fleet Command was already beginning to plan. Deep within Skarn territory, in a command structure built into the hollowed-out interior of a moon that had been converted into a military headquarters generations earlier, Fleet Commander Dessa Vral stood before a council of senior officers and made her case with a patience that surprised even herself. "I am not proposing that we abandon the idea of engaging this ship," she told them. "I am proposing that we stop trying to defeat it the way we would defeat any other slow target. Every group that has attacked the patience directly has been destroyed, because every group has assumed that its slowness is a weakness to be exploited quickly, before the humans can respond. That assumption is wrong. The ship does not need to be fast, because it is never actually vulnerable long enough for speed to matter." "Then what do you propose?" asked one of the older commanders, a grizzled veteran named Corandes who had fought in the Tauran Wars and did not care much for theories that could not be tested with a simple, direct application of force. "I propose we stop thinking of this as a single battle to be won quickly," Vral said. "I propose we study it the way we would study a fortress rather than a ship. Fortresses are not defeated by a single bold charge. They are defeated by patience, by understanding their weaknesses over time, by finding the one gap in their defenses that even the most thorough design cannot entirely close." "And if there is no gap?" Vral thought of the 11 seconds it had taken the Patience's point defense grid to end Torv Hessek's life, and the strange, cold certainty she had felt in that moment, watching a young pilot's ambition turn instantly into debris. "There is always a gap," she said, though she was not entirely certain she believed it herself. "We simply have not been patient enough to find it yet." The council was silent for a long moment. Then Corandes, who had spent 40 years learning to recognize when stubbornness was a virtue and when it was simply foolishness, gave a slow nod. "You have 6 months," he said. "Use them wisely, Commander Vral. If you cannot find a gap in 6 months, we will assume there isn't one, and we will leave that ship, and whatever fleet it belongs to, well enough alone." Vral accepted the terms, and as the council dispersed, she found herself thinking not about strategy, or tactics, or the 6 months of research now stretching out ahead of her, but about the calm, unhurried way the gray mountain of a ship had continued forward after killing one of her pilots, as though nothing of any significance had happened at all. She intended to find out exactly how true that calm really was, and exactly what it would take to finally shake it. David Achebe, the young intelligence officer who had first flagged the Skarn fleet's unusual behavior, found himself promoted to a small permanent desk within Fleet Intelligence's Perimeter Division a few months after his initial report reached senior command. It was not a glamorous posting. It involved long hours reading sensor logs, tracking supply movements, and building slow, patient profiles of the various species who lived and traded and occasionally fought along the edges of human territory. But Achebe found that he liked the work, in the same quiet way that Elena Marsh liked commanding a ship that never needed to hurry. "You think they're actually going to try something?" his supervisor asked him one afternoon, reviewing the growing file on Skarn fleet movements that Achebe had been steadily assembling. "I think Commander Vral is smarter than most of the people who have tried this before her," Achebe said. "The ones who lost fast. Lost because they tried to solve the problem the way they'd solve any other problem. More force, more speed, more aggression." She pulled back. "She's studying instead of attacking. That's rarer than you'd think, and it worries me more than another reckless charge would." "Why?" "Because reckless charges get people killed quickly, and then everyone learns the lesson and moves on. Patient study sometimes finds something. I don't know if it will this time, but I'd rather we assume it might, and prepare accordingly, than assume the patience is untouchable, and get caught flat-footed if it turns out not to be." His supervisor considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep watching them," she said. "Flag anything unusual, and send a copy of your assessment to Captain Marsh directly. She should hear this from someone who's actually thought it through, not just a summary that gets filtered through 6 layers of command before it reaches her." Elena Marsh received Achebe's assessment 3 weeks later, delivered through the same slow, careful communication channels that carried most news to a ship as far out on patrol as the Patience usually was. She read it twice, in the quiet of her own quarters, long after most of the ship's crew had shifted into the reduced staffing pattern that marked the ship's version of night. She had read a great many similar assessments over her years in command, most of them from analysts far more senior than a junior officer freshly assigned to perimeter intelligence. Most of them said roughly the same thing, in roughly the same language. "A species has tested us. A species has failed. Monitor for further activity." Achebe's report was different in a way she found herself appreciating. It did not simply catalog what had happened. It tried to explain why the pattern of Skarn behavior mattered, and it did so with a kind of careful, unhurried reasoning that reminded her, oddly, of the training doctrine she had spent her entire career trying to instill in her own crew. She drafted a short reply, thanking the young officer for his work, and adding a single line of her own observation that she thought might be useful to a young analyst still learning the shape of his craft. "Most people who study us are looking for a weakness to exploit. It sounds like you're looking to understand us instead. That is a rarer and more useful skill than you may realize. Keep at it." She did not know, when she sent it, that David Achebe would keep that message for the rest of his career, or that it would shape the way he approached every piece of intelligence work he did for the following 2 decades, teaching him to look past the obvious question of how an enemy might be beaten and toward the more useful question of why they behaved the way they did in the first place. Meanwhile, deep in Skarn territory, the 6 months granted to Fleet Commander Vral by Corin Dess's council began to pass with a slowness that surprised even her. She had expected the research to move quickly, the way most Skarn military efforts tended to move, driven by impatience and a cultural preference for bold, decisive action over careful deliberation. Instead, she found herself forced to relearn habits of thought that did not come naturally to her, poring over data with her small research team, testing hypotheses cautiously, rather than acting on the first promising idea that presented itself. "This is not how we usually do things," Kes Ondar admitted to her one evening, several weeks into their research, both of them exhausted after a long day spent reviewing sensor data from the latest round of drone probes. "No," Vral agreed, "it isn't. I find myself wondering if that's exactly the point." Perhaps the reason nobody has beaten this ship yet isn't because nobody has been strong enough or fast enough. Perhaps it's because almost nobody has been patient enough to actually understand it before trying. You think patience is the weapon they're actually using against us? I think, Vral said slowly, choosing her words with more care than she usually bothered with in private conversation, that the humans learned something a long time ago that most of the rest of us never had to learn, because most of the rest of us have never come as close to losing everything as they apparently did. I think they learned that speed and aggression are wonderful tools right up until the moment your enemy figures out how to use them against you. And I think they built a ship and an entire fleet doctrine specifically designed to make sure that lesson never had to be learned twice. Ondar said nothing for a long moment, turning the observation over in his mind. That's an uncomfortable thing to say about people we may end up fighting. It's an uncomfortable thing to be true, Vral said, but I would rather understand my enemy clearly and uncomfortably than misunderstand them comfortably, right up until the moment that misunderstanding gets my whole fleet killed. 6 months, Dessa Vral quickly discovered, was both a very long time and nowhere near long enough. She spent the first month simply gathering every scrap of information the Skarn had ever collected about the patients and ships like it, pulling records from a dozen different archives, cross-referencing accounts from traders, mercenaries, and the occasional diplomat who had crossed paths with human fleets over the past several decades. What she found painted a picture that was both consistent and frustratingly incomplete. Every account agreed on the ship's basic characteristics: slow, heavily armored, devastating in combat, but only ever seen fighting defensively, never launching an unprovoked attack of its own. No account described the Patience, or any of its sister ships, ever pursuing a fleeing enemy. They simply defended themselves, with total and overwhelming effectiveness, and then continued on whatever course they had been holding before the engagement began, as though the battle itself had been little more than an interruption to their real business. That detail nagged at her more than any other. A ship that never chased, a ship that never seemed interested in conquest, or territory, or revenge. It suggested a species that had built these vessels not as instruments of expansion, but as something closer to a very large, very patient shield. Vral found herself, somewhat against her own instincts, beginning to respect the philosophy, even as she searched for a way to defeat it. They are not soldiers looking for glory, she said to her small research team, gathered in a briefing room deep inside the moon base. They are farmers protecting a field. You do not need to be fast to protect a field. You only need to be dangerous enough that nothing wants to walk into it uninvited. Then how do we get something to walk into their field and survive long enough to learn its secrets? Asked Kes Ondar, her chief tactical analyst, a younger officer whose calm, methodical thinking had earned him a place on the research team despite his relative inexperience. That, Vral admitted, is the entire problem. They began, cautiously, with small and deliberately expendable probes. Automated drones, built to look like ordinary sensor platforms rather than weapons, launched from unmarked freighters at long range and allowed to drift into the general vicinity of Patience-class ships whenever Skarn intelligence could confirm one was operating nearby. Most of the drones were ignored entirely, the ships apparently unbothered by sensor equipment that made no aggressive moves and stayed well outside any reasonable engagement range. But when Kes Ondar grew bolder and began sending drones equipped with weak, low-power weapon systems, just enough to register as a genuine threat rather than passive sensor equipment, the pattern became sharply, consistently clear. Every single armed drone that came within a certain calculated range of a Patience-class ship was destroyed, always by a single precise shot, always without any warning ping or visible targeting sequence beforehand. "It's not reacting to us," Ondar reported to Vral after the 14th drone had been destroyed in an identical fashion. "It's not scanning the drone, identifying it as a threat, and then responding. The response happens too fast for that sequence to be possible, every single time. It's as though the ship already knows, the moment something crosses a certain boundary, that it needs to be destroyed, and the actual firing happens almost as an afterthought." "A perimeter," Vral said slowly, working through the implication. "Not a targeting system. A perimeter. Anything that crosses into a certain range, armed or capable of being armed, gets removed automatically, without a human crew member needing to make the decision at all." That would explain the 11 seconds with Torv Hessek, Ondar agreed. He wasn't being tracked and predicted. He simply crossed into a boundary the ship's automated systems had already been calculating for, based on the maximum possible range of a fighter his size and speed. Then the gap isn't in how fast the ship reacts, Vral said. The gap has to be in the boundary itself. If the perimeter is calculated based on the maximum theoretical range of a threat, then something that falls outside those calculations, something the system was never designed to expect, might not trigger the same automatic response. It was, she knew even as she said it, a thin thread of hope to build an entire strategy around. But it was the only thread they had found in 5 months of careful, patient research. And with barely 4 weeks remaining before Corandess's deadline arrived, she did not have the luxury of searching for a better one. Aboard the Patience, life continued in the same steady, unhurried rhythm it always had, mostly untouched by the quiet research campaign being waged against it from a moon base deep in Skarn territory. Elena Marsh had read David Achebe's intelligence report about the Skarn fleet's unusual behavior with interest, but not alarm. She had commanded this ship, or served aboard it, for 2 decades, and in that time she had watched a dozen different species attempt a dozen different approaches to understanding or defeating it. Most had given up quickly, discouraged by early losses. A few had persisted longer, running the same kind of careful, probing research that the drone data now suggested the Skarn were conducting. "They're testing our perimeter," reported Tomas Ruiz, reviewing the accumulated sensor logs from the past several months of low-level drone activity. Small, cheap probes, armed just enough to trigger a response, sent from long range so they can't be traced back easily. They're mapping exactly where our automated defenses engage, and where they don't. "Let them," Elena said, not looking up from the maintenance schedule she was reviewing. "It won't help them." "You're confident about that?" "I'm confident because I understand what they're going to find. Eventually, if they keep at it long enough." She set the schedule aside and looked at her sensor officer directly. "They're going to figure out that our perimeter is calculated based on the maximum realistic threat range of whatever's approaching us. And they're going to think that means if they send something that falls outside those calculations, something faster or with a longer effective range than what we're expecting, it might slip through untouched." "Won't it?" Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile, the expression of someone who had answered this exact question many times before, for many different crew members over many different years. "The perimeter isn't the only layer of defense this ship has, Tomas. It's the first layer, the simplest one. It exists to deal with small, unsophisticated threats quickly and efficiently, without wasting the crew's attention on something that doesn't deserve it. Anyone patient enough and clever enough to find a gap in the perimeter is going to run straight into everything else we've built behind it. And they don't know that." "No," Elena said, "they don't. And that's rather the point of building 4 separate layers of defense instead of just one. The ones who are smart enough to get past the first layer are exactly the ones dangerous enough to need the rest." Kes Ondar found his gap 3 weeks before the deadline, and it filled him with an excitement that he had to work hard to keep out of his voice when he reported it to Fleet Commander Vral. "Long-range kinetic projectiles," he explained, laying out a series of technical diagrams across the briefing room table. "Not drones, not fighters, not anything with an engine or a power signature the automated perimeter would recognize as a credible weapon platform. Simple, unpowered slugs of dense metal, launched from well outside the perimeter's calculated engagement range, using a mass driver system that gives them enough velocity to close the remaining distance in under 2 seconds once they enter the boundary." 2 seconds, Vral repeated. "Is that fast enough to matter?" "According to our data, the perimeter's automated response, whatever its exact mechanism is, requires the target to be moving under its own power, or at least broadcasting a detectable propulsion signature, before it registers as a threat worth engaging. An unpowered slug, coasting on momentum alone, doesn't trigger that same recognition. It should, in theory, be functionally invisible to the system until it's far too close to intercept. You're proposing we bombard the ship with metal slugs and hope enough of them get through to do damage before their crew notices and reacts." "I'm proposing something more precise than that," Ondar said. "If we can determine the ship's likely course and speed in advance, we can position mass drivers along its predicted path, well outside any range that would trigger their perimeter defenses, and fire slugs calculated to intercept the ship's own position at the moment it arrives. We wouldn't need to react to the ship at all. We would simply need to be patient enough to let it walk into our own calculated field, the same way its perimeter has been doing to every fighter and drone we've sent against it. Vral studied the diagrams for a long moment, feeling something that was almost admiration for the elegance of the idea, mixed uneasily with the memory of every warning she had given herself about underestimating this particular enemy. "It's the same trick they use against us," she said finally. "Turn back on them." "Yes, Commander. And if it doesn't work? If there's another layer behind the perimeter that we haven't found yet?" Ondar hesitated, and in that hesitation, Vral saw the honest answer he did not want to say aloud. "Then we will have learned something else about the ship, Commander, at significant cost." Vral thought of Corin Des and the Council, and the deadline now less than a month away, and the 11 fleets before her own scouting mission that had vanished entirely, leaving nothing behind but silence and speculation. She thought, too, of the strange, unwilling respect she had developed for a species that built ships not to conquer, but simply to never be conquered themselves. "Prepare the mass drivers," she said. "We'll test it with a limited engagement first, small enough that if we're wrong, we lose little. Large enough that if we're right, we finally learn something worth 6 months of patience." The test came on a quiet stretch of the perimeter frontier, in a system that human charts labeled simply as Corridor 7, a stretch of empty space that Patience-class ships regularly used as a patrol route between two of the more populated human colonies in the sector. Skarn intelligence had spent weeks confirming the pattern, tracking the Patience's movements closely enough, from a careful distance, to predict its course through Corridor 7 with reasonable confidence. 12 mass driver platforms were positioned along the predicted path, each one carefully calculated to fire its payload at the precise moment and trajectory needed to intercept the ship as it passed through a specific stretch of empty space. The platforms themselves were unpowered until the moment of firing, drifting silently on pre-calculated courses, indistinguishable from ordinary debris to any passive scan that did not know exactly what to look for. Aboard the Patience, Tomas Ruiz noticed the anomaly almost by accident, flagged by a junior sensor technician who had been running a routine debris mapping scan of the corridor ahead and found the density and distribution of small objects along their projected course slightly, almost imperceptibly, different from the historical baseline for that region. "Captain, I want to flag something," Ruiz said. "Might be nothing. Debris pattern ahead of us doesn't quite match our historical scans of this corridor. Density is about 8% higher than expected, and the objects are a bit too evenly spaced to be natural." Elena Marsh looked up from her console, and something in her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had served under her long enough to read it. "Show me," she said. Ruiz pulled up the comparison data, overlaying the current scan against years of historical baseline readings for Corridor 7. The pattern, once highlighted, was clear: a dozen small objects, evenly spaced along a stretch of the ship's predicted path, each one sitting perfectly still, waiting. "They found a workaround for the perimeter," Elena said quietly, more to herself than to her crew. "Unpowered projectiles. Clever." "Do we alter course?" Ruiz asked. "Avoid the field entirely?" Elena considered the question for a long moment, and when she answered, there was something in her voice that was almost approving, the tone of a teacher watching a difficult student finally solve a problem that had stumped every student before them. "No," she said. "Let's see what they've built. Hold our current course and speed. Signal engineering to bring the secondary defense grid online. Full power, but keep it passive. I want them to think their trick is working, right up until the moment it stops working." "You're letting them fire on us deliberately." "I'm letting them learn," Elena said. "Exactly what I told you a month ago. The perimeter was never the only thing standing between this crew and a bad day. Let's go show our new friends what comes after it." The Patience continued forward, unhurried, into the field of waiting slugs, exactly as it had continued forward through every threat and every test in the 11 years Elena Marsh had commanded it, giving no outward sign that it had noticed anything unusual at all. In the final days before the test, Kes Ondar found himself unable to sleep properly, running the same calculations over and over in his quarters aboard Vral's flagship. checking and rechecking every variable that might affect the outcome. He was not by nature a nervous man. He had built his reputation on calm, methodical thinking, the kind of officer who solved problems by breaking them into smaller pieces, rather than by force of will alone. But something about this particular problem gnawed at him in a way that his usual discipline struggled to quiet. "You've checked those numbers 4 times today," his assistant, a quiet young technician named Farah Osen, observed during one of his late-night review sessions. "They haven't changed since this morning." "I know," Ondar admitted. "I keep hoping I'll find something I missed. Some reason this won't work, or some reason it will work better than expected. Either answer would be easier to sit with than not knowing." "Do you think it will work?" Ondar considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider every question that mattered. "I think the physics are sound," he said. "Unpowered projectiles, precisely calculated trajectories, time to arrive exactly when the ship's own predicted course puts it in the right place. If their perimeter really does rely on detecting propulsion signatures the way our data suggests, then yes, I think it should work, at least in the sense of getting past that first layer. But I keep thinking about Commander Vral's report from 4 months ago, when she watched Torv Hessek die in 11 seconds. She wrote that it wasn't a target, it was a puzzle. I've spent 4 months solving one piece of that puzzle. I don't know how many pieces there are, and I don't know what happens if I'm right about this piece and catastrophically wrong about how many more are waiting behind it." Farah Osen, young enough that she had not yet learned to carry the weight of that kind of uncertainty as easily as her superior officer had, said nothing for a while. "Then I suppose," she said finally, "we're about to find out." The mass driver platforms themselves had been a small engineering triumph in their own right, though nobody outside Ondar's immediate research team would ever know the full extent of the work that had gone into building them. Constructing a weapon platform with no detectable power signature until the exact moment of firing required solving problems that Skarn engineering had never seriously attempted before, since most Skarn weapons doctrine assumed speed and visible aggression rather than patient, silent positioning. The engineers who built the 12 platforms worked in near total secrecy, operating out of a small fabrication yard on the edge of Skarn space that had been repurposed specifically for the project. They tested early prototypes against simple stationary targets first, refining the trigger mechanisms and the guidance systems until the margin of error on each shot fell within the narrow tolerances Ondar's calculations required. It was slow, careful, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely earned recognition even when it succeeded, and the engineers who did it understood that if their platforms failed during the actual test against the patients, there would be no opportunity to learn from the mistake and try again. "We only get one attempt at this," the lead engineer, a weathered veteran named Bosk Vantil, reminded his team more than once during the final weeks of construction. "If we're off by even a few seconds in our timing, the whole approach is wasted, and we'll have told the humans exactly what we're capable of, without gaining anything in return." The platforms were finished with 11 days to spare before the planned test date, and Bosk Vantil allowed himself, for the first time in months, a full night's sleep. Word of the planned test reached only a small circle within Skarn Fleet Command, deliberately kept separate from the broader military bureaucracy in case of leaks. Coran Des, as head of the council overseeing Vral's 6-month deadline, insisted on being briefed personally before authorizing the operation, and he listened to Ondar's presentation with the same skeptical, unhurried attention he brought to every proposal that crossed his desk. "You're certain the ship won't detect the platforms before they fire," he said when Ondar had finished. "As certain as 6 months of drone testing allows me to be, Commander. The platforms carry no active power signature until the moment of launch. To any passive scan, they should appear as ordinary debris, indistinguishable from the natural background of the corridor. And if you're wrong, then we will have given away the location and general capability of a weapon system we spent months building, in exchange for nothing," Ondar said honestly. "I won't pretend the risk isn't real, Commander, but I believe it's the most promising approach we've found in 6 months of research, and we are rapidly running out of time to find a better one." Coran Des studied the younger officer for a long moment, the way he studied most junior officers who came before him with careful plans and uncertain outcomes, weighing ambition against genuine competence. "Commander Vral trusts your work?" "She does." "Then I'll trust it as well. For now." Des said. But understand, Lieutenant Ondar, that if this fails as badly as it could, the responsibility for what happens next falls on you as much as it falls on her. Choose your calculations carefully. I intend to, Commander, Ondar said. I always do. The 12 mass driver platforms fired within half a second of each other, exactly as Kes Ondar's calculations had predicted, sending 12 dense slugs of metal, streaking silently through the dark, toward the point in space, where the Patience was expected to be, in just under 90 seconds. Aboard Fleet Commander Vral's flagship, positioned at a cautious distance well outside the engagement zone, the bridge crew watched the tactical display in tense silence. Kes Ondar stood beside the commander's chair, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, watching the 12 small markers representing the slugs converge slowly toward the larger marker representing the Patience. No change in their course or speed, the sensor officer reported. No sign they've detected the projectiles. Time to impact? 40 seconds. Vral said nothing, her eyes fixed on the display, waiting. Aboard the Patience, Elena Marsh watched the same convergence unfold on her own tactical readout, calm and unhurried, as though watching a weather pattern develop rather than an incoming attack. Secondary grid status? Fully charged, Captain, reported the ship's weapons officer, a quiet, precise woman named Priya Nandal, who had served on the Patience for nearly as long as Elena herself. Standing by on your order. Wait for my mark, Elena said. I want them close enough that there's no question about what happened. Let's not leave any room for doubt. The seconds ticked past. 20 seconds to impact. 15. 10. Mark, Elena said quietly. Priya Nandal's hands moved across her console with practiced efficiency, and the Patience's secondary defense grid, a series of weapons batteries positioned across the ship's hull that had remained dormant and unpowered throughout the entire approach, activated in a single coordinated burst. Unlike the automated point defense turrets that had destroyed Torv Hessek's fighter through a simple, pre-calculated boundary response, the secondary grid was designed for exactly this kind of scenario. Threats that had slipped past the ship's first layer of defense, requiring a more deliberate, more precisely targeted response. All 12 slugs were intercepted within a span of 3 seconds, each one struck by a focused burst of defensive fire that vaporized the dense metal projectiles well before they reached the Patience's hull. On Vral's flagship, the bridge crew watched in stunned silence as all 12 markers on their tactical display simply vanished. Report, Vral said, her voice tight. All 12 projectiles destroyed, Commander. Impact 0. The ship. It wasn't even scanning for them beforehand, as far as we can tell. There's no record of an active search pattern. It just waited until they were close enough, and then it destroyed all 12 of them in under 3 seconds. Kes Ondar felt something cold settle in his stomach as he stared at the display. There's a second layer, he said quietly, exactly like I feared. The perimeter isn't a defense system, it's a filter. It's designed to let the small, obvious threats through unnoticed, so the crew doesn't waste attention on them, and leave the real defense to whatever's waiting behind it. Can we overwhelm the second layer? Vral asked. More projectiles, more platforms, enough volume that they can't intercept everything? I don't know, Ondar admitted. We don't know its limits. We don't know how many simultaneous targets it can track, or how much power it has behind it, or whether there's a third layer waiting behind that one, if we ever manage to punch through the second. Vral looked at the tactical display, at the calm, unhurried gray ship continuing forward through Corridor 7 exactly as it had before the attack, its course and speed entirely unchanged, as though the entire engagement had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. They didn't even alter course, she said. They didn't retreat. They didn't call for reinforcements. They didn't even bother firing back at our platforms. They simply defended themselves and kept walking. Because they don't need to do anything else, Ondar said, and for the first time in 6 months of research, his voice carried something close to genuine fear rather than professional curiosity. Commander, I don't think we're looking at a warship that happens to be well defended. I think we're looking at a ship that was built, from its very first design specification, around the assumption that it would eventually face exactly this kind of layered, patient attack, and that every layer of defense would need to be strong enough to make the next attack simply not worth attempting. Aboard the Patience, in the amber-lit control room, Elena Marsh watched the 12 projectiles disappear from her tactical display and allowed herself a small, quiet breath, the closest thing to a sigh of genuine effort that she permitted herself in front of her crew. Casualties? Damage? None, Captain. Secondary grid handled it cleanly. Power reserves at 94%, well within normal parameters. Good. She turned to Priya Nandal. Compile the engagement data, full sensor logs, and send it to Fleet Intelligence with a note. Tell them the Skarn have moved past simple provocation. They're conducting a deliberate, methodical research campaign against our defensive layers, and I expect them to keep escalating unless we give them a clear reason to stop. You want to send a message, Ruiz said, understanding immediately where the captain's thinking was heading. I want to send a message, Elena confirmed. Not an attack. We're not the ones who started this, and I have no interest in escalating a conflict that doesn't need to happen. But I also have no interest in spending the next 6 months fending off increasingly sophisticated attempts to find a gap in our defenses, when a much simpler solution exists. What solution is that? Elena Marsh looked at the tactical display, at the distant marker representing Fleet Commander Vral's flagship, still holding position well outside engagement range. Sometimes, she said, the fastest way to end a fight nobody needs to have is to let the other side see exactly what they'd be facing if they kept pushing, not a threat, a demonstration. The demonstration, when it came 3 days later, was not delivered through violence. Elena Marsh authorized a single encrypted transmission to be broadcast on a frequency she knew the Skarn fleet would be monitoring, carrying with it a compressed data package that contained something Fleet Command had debated for nearly a full day before finally granting permission to send. A partial, carefully redacted overview of the Patience's defensive architecture, stripped of any details that could be used to actually design a countermeasure, but detailed enough to make one thing unmistakably clear. The perimeter that Kessondar had so carefully mapped and circumvented was, indeed, only the first of 5 distinct defensive layers built into the ship's design. The secondary grid that had destroyed the 12 mass driver slugs was only the second. Behind it sat 3 further layers, each one more sophisticated and more heavily resourced than the last, culminating in a final tier of defense that the transmission described, in language that was almost clinical in its bluntness, as capable of engaging and neutralizing a fleet of over 200 capital ships simultaneously, without requiring any single human crew member to authorize an individual targeting decision. The message that accompanied the data was short, and it was signed not by Elena Marsh, but by the broader authority of Fleet Command itself, a deliberate choice meant to communicate that this was not one captain's personal opinion, but the settled position of an entire species. This vessel was built after we learned, at great cost, what happens to a species that cannot defend itself. We have no wish for conflict with the Skarn people. We have observed your research with patience, and we have allowed it to continue because we understand curiosity, and because none of your tests have posed any genuine threat to this ship or its crew. But patience has limits, and continued escalation will eventually cross from curiosity into open hostility. We would prefer that did not happen. The choice, from this point forward, belongs to you. Fleet Commander Dessa Vral read the message 3 times before she called her council together, and when she finally spoke, in the same hollowed-out chamber deep inside the Skarn moonbase where she had first proposed her research campaign 6 months earlier, her voice carried a weight that surprised even the veterans among her officers. They let us see, she said, exactly enough to understand what we would be facing if we continued. Not everything. Not enough to build a real countermeasure. Just enough to make clear that everything we've learned in 6 months of careful, patient research represents perhaps 1/10 of what that ship is actually capable of defending against. You believe them? Corin Dess asked, his voice gruff but no longer carrying the dismissive edge it had held at the start of the council's deliberations. I believe, Vral said carefully, that a species who watched their own homeworld nearly destroyed, who built an entire class of warship around the principle of never letting that happen again, would not exaggerate a threat they didn't need to exaggerate. They've had 11 fleets before ours test them and vanish entirely. They didn't need to send us a warning. They could simply have let us keep testing until we made a mistake large enough to justify destroying us the same way they destroyed everyone else. The fact that they chose to warn us instead when they clearly could have simply waited us out, tells me something important about what kind of enemy they actually are. What does it tell you? That they are not looking for a fight, Vral said. They are looking to be left alone, with enough force behind that wish that nobody sane would consider testing it twice. And I think, Commander Des, that after 6 months and 12 destroyed mass driver platforms, we have learned everything we're going to learn about that ship, without risking a war we cannot win, against an opponent who has made it very clear they do not need to move quickly to make sure they're never the ones who lose. The Council was silent for a long time after that, the weight of 6 months of careful research, 12 destroyed platforms, and 1 dead pilot settling over the chamber like a physical thing. Recommendation? Corin Des asked finally. Withdraw, Vral said, formally. Not in retreat, but in acknowledgement. Send word to the humans that the Skarn fleet has concluded its research into the capabilities of Patience-class vessels, and that we have no further interest in testing them. Let them know that we understand, now, exactly what kind of mountain we were foolish enough to think we could climb. 3 weeks later, a formal diplomatic message arrived aboard the Patience, transmitted through a neutral relay station that both human and Skarn vessels used for exactly this kind of careful, arm's-length communication. Elena Marsh read it in the amber-lit quiet of her control room, and for the first time in the entire 6-month engagement, she allowed herself something closer to a genuine smile. The message was brief, formal, and carefully worded, exactly the kind of careful diplomatic language that species with long, difficult histories of conflict tended to use when they wanted to end hostilities, without either side needing to formally admit defeat. It acknowledged, in polite and roundabout terms, that the Skarn fleet's research into human defensive capabilities had reached a satisfactory conclusion, and that no further engagements with Patience-class vessels would be undertaken without significant and unmistakable provocation from the human side. They're calling it a mutual understanding, Ruiz said, reading over the transmission a second time. Not a surrender, not even really an apology. They don't need to apologize, Elena said. They tested us, the way most species eventually do, and they were smart enough and patient enough to stop before it cost them everything the way it cost the others. You almost sound like you respect them. Elena Marsh considered the question for a moment, thinking of Torv Hessig's fighter disappearing into debris, and 12 mass driver slugs vaporized in 3 seconds, and the long, careful, methodical 6 months of research that a species she had never met had poured into understanding a ship that most others simply attacked and died against without ever bothering to learn anything at all. I do respect them, she said finally. They're the first ones in a long time who took the time to actually think, instead of just charging in and hoping for the best. That kind of patience is rare. It's also, she added, allowing herself a small, dry smile, exactly the kind of quality that makes for a good ally, if it ever comes to that, instead of an enemy. The Patience continued forward, unhurried as ever, deeper into the quiet dark of the perimeter frontier, its course unchanged, its crew calm, its long and careful reputation, now grown by one more chapter that would, in time, spread through the same slow, quiet channels that every story about the ship eventually traveled through. Trader gossip, cautious diplomatic notes, and the careful, respectful silence of everyone who had ever come close enough to learn exactly why nobody who understood the truth ever dared to challenge it twice. Behind the scenes of the formal diplomatic exchange, a quieter, more personal conversation took place that neither Fleet Command nor Skarn Command ever made part of the official record. Elena Marsh, exercising a degree of discretion granted to captains of Patience-class vessels precisely because Fleet Command trusted their judgment after years of proven restraint, requested and received permission to send a short, informal message directly to Fleet Commander Vral, separate from the official diplomatic channel. Commander Vral, I wanted to say, captain to captain, that your restraint at the end of this matters more than you may realize. Many species who test us either escalate until they are destroyed, or vanish and never explain themselves to their own people. You did neither. You looked closely, you learned what you could, and you made the harder choice to stop before the cost became unbearable. That is a rarer quality in a commander than raw courage, and I respect it. I hope our two peoples never need to test each other again, but if circumstances ever bring us to the same table for reasons other than war, I would welcome the conversation. E. Marsh, Captain. UES Patience. Vral read the message several times before deciding how to respond, turning over in her mind the strange, unexpected shape of an enemy who had spent 6 months allowing her fleet to probe its defenses, and then, at the end of it, sent something that read less like a warning and more like the beginning of a genuine respect between two people who had simply been fighting on opposite sides of a conflict neither of them had truly wanted. Her reply, when she finally sent it, was shorter, but no less considered. Captain Marsh, 6 months ago I believed patience was a weakness, dressed up as a virtue by a species too slow to keep pace with the rest of us. I no longer believe that. I do not know if our peoples will ever need each other, but I would rather know a mountain is on my side than have to climb it again. D. Vral, Fleet Commander. Neither message was ever made public, though copies of both eventually found their way, years later, into the private archives of officers on both sides who studied the exchange as an example of how two commanders, on opposite sides of a conflict that could easily have spiraled into something far worse, had chosen instead to end it with something closer to mutual understanding. Aboard the Patience, in the weeks following the resolution of the Skarn engagement, life returned to the same steady, unhurried rhythm that had defined the ship's existence for over a decade. Priya Nandal filed her final after-action report on the secondary defense grid's performance, noting with characteristic precision that the system had performed exactly within expected parameters and required no adjustments. Tomas Ruiz updated the ship's threat assessment database, adding the Skarn to a growing list of species who had tested the Patience and ultimately chosen restraint over continued escalation, a list that fleet intelligence found increasingly useful as a reference for predicting how new, unfamiliar species might behave when they eventually encountered a Patience-class vessel of their own. Elena Marsh, for her part, spent a quiet evening reviewing the entire engagement from start to finish, from Rule Ven's first tense report of sighting the ship to Vral's formal acknowledgement of withdrawal 3 weeks after the mass driver test. She found herself thinking, as she often did after a significant engagement, about the young pilot who had died in the opening days of the encounter, and about how easily the entire 6 months could have unfolded very differently if either side had been a little less patient, a little more eager to prove a point through force rather than careful restraint. "Do you ever wonder," Ruiz asked her, during one of the quiet late-shift conversations that had become something of a tradition between them over the years, what would happen if a species came along that genuinely didn't care about restraint, something that just kept throwing everything it had at us, no matter the cost, no matter how many fleets it lost? Elena considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions her crew brought to her. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I think that's exactly the kind of enemy this ship was built to survive. Not the clever ones, not the patient ones like the Skarn turned out to be. The reckless ones, the ones who don't learn from the first 11 fleets, or the 12th, or the 30th. That's why we have 5 layers instead of 1, Tomas. Because somewhere out there, eventually, we may meet someone who needs to see all 5 before they finally understand. And if even 5 isn't enough?" Elena Marsh looked out at the calm, steady lights of her own bridge, at the crew who had trained for exactly this kind of patient, unhurried readiness for years, and she allowed herself, for just a moment, the small comfort of certainty that came from 2 decades of proven doctrine. "Then we'll build a 6th, she said, "and a 7th if we need it. That's the whole point, Tomas. We don't get to decide how patient the galaxy is going to make us. We only get to decide how ready we are when it finally asks." Stories, in the vast quiet spaces between star systems, traveled slowly, much like the ship they concerned. There was no instant network connecting every corner of inhabited space, no single news source that every species trusted equally. Instead, stories moved the way water moves through soil, seeping outward through trade routes and diplomatic channels, and the idle gossip of freighter crews sharing a drink at some neutral way station, until eventually, months or even years later, they reached ears that had never heard them before. The story of the Skarn fleet's 6-month research campaign against the Patience, and its quiet, careful conclusion, took the better part of 2 years to fully spread through the perimeter sector and beyond. By the time it reached the more distant reaches of known space, it had changed slightly in the telling, the way stories always do, gaining small embellishments here and losing minor details there, but the core of it remained consistent. repeated by trader after trader, diplomat after diplomat, until it settled into something close to established fact among the species who did business anywhere near human territory. The Skarn had tried. Genuinely, patiently, more carefully than any of the 11 fleets before them. They had spent 6 months and lost a dozen automated platforms and 1 young pilot, and at the end of it, their own fleet commander had gone before her own council and recommended, without hesitation or shame, that they simply stop. That detail, more than any other, was the one that seemed to matter most to the species who eventually heard it. Not that the Skarn had lost, because plenty of species had lost to the patients before them, usually badly, and usually all at once. What mattered was that the Skarn, a people known across the sector for their aggression and their pride, had looked closely and carefully at what they were facing, and had chosen, deliberately and without any illusions about what that choice meant for their reputation, to walk away rather than continue pushing. If the Skarn, who feared very little, had decided that ship was not worth testing twice, then perhaps, the reasoning went, it truly was not worth testing at all. Aboard the Patience, the years that followed the Skarn engagement passed much as the years before it had, slowly, steadily, and largely without incident. The ship continued its long patrol routes along the perimeter frontier, occasionally shadowed by curious scouts from one species or another, none of whom ever repeated the mistake Torv Hessek had made, and none of whom ever attempted the kind of patient, methodical research campaign the Skarn had conducted. Elena Marsh grew a little older, a little grayer, and continued to command her ship with the same calm, unhurried patience that had defined her entire career. She trained new officers the same way she had been trained, drilling into them the same lessons that had been passed down through 7 generations of ship design and 11 years of her own command experience. Never rush, never panic, and trust that a ship built to survive being tested would keep surviving, as long as its crew kept faith with the philosophy that had built it. "You'll hear stories about us," she told a class of new cadets during one of her rare visits back to a human shipyard for routine refit and resupply, standing before a group of young officers who had grown up hearing about the Patience as something closer to legend than fact. "Some of them will be true. Some of them will grow taller in the telling, the way stories always do. But I want you to understand something that doesn't always come through in the stories. Something I think is more important than all the layers of armor and all the redundant systems and all the automated defenses this ship carries." She paused, looking out at the young faces watching her, remembering her own younger self standing inside a half-finished armor plate 2 decades earlier, thinking about promises rather than coffins. "This ship was never built to win wars," she said. "It was built so that we would never have to fight one again. Every layer of defense we carry exists for exactly one purpose, to make sure that anyone who looks at us and thinks about causing harm decides, on their own, patiently and rationally, that it simply isn't worth trying. We are not fast. We are not aggressive. We do not chase, and we do not conquer, and we do not go looking for glory in someone else's blood. We are patient, and we are difficult to hurt, and we intend to stay that way for exactly as long as it takes for the rest of this galaxy to learn what the Skarn eventually learned, that some mountains simply aren't worth climbing." Far away, in the hollowed-out chambers of the Skarn moonbase, Fleet Commander Dessa Vral kept a small, unremarkable memento on her desk, long after her research campaign against the Patience had concluded. A single fragment of debris, no larger than her closed fist, recovered from the wreckage of Torv Hessek's fighter, and returned to Skarn territory, along with a formal, respectful note of condolence that the human Fleet Command had sent, unprompted, several weeks after the engagement had ended. She kept it not as a trophy, and not as a reminder of failure, but as something closer to a lesson she wanted to make sure she never forgot. Ambition without patience got young pilots killed. Aggression without understanding cost fleets their ships, and cost commanders their reputations, and occasionally cost entire species the kind of hard-won respect that took generations to rebuild once it had been lost. She had gone before her own council, years earlier, and told them that some mountains simply weren't worth climbing, and in the years since, as she had risen through Skarn command structure to positions of greater and greater authority, she had made sure that lesson was taught to every young, ambitious pilot who came through her training programs. the same way Elena Marsh taught her own young cadets aboard the Patience. Sometimes, late at night, working alone in her quarters, Vral found herself wondering what might have happened if she had pushed further, if she had ignored the humans' quiet warning and continued her research campaign despite the risk. She never found a satisfying answer to that question, and eventually she stopped looking for one. Some questions, she had come to understand, were better left unanswered, the way some mountains were better left unclimbed. The story that eventually spread across the sector, the one that traders and diplomats and curious young officers of a dozen different species told each other in quiet moments over the following decades, never fully captured the careful philosophy behind the ship, or the painful history that had shaped it, or the quiet, patient dedication of the crew who kept it running, generation after generation, exactly as it had been designed to run. Instead, the story that survived was simpler, the way stories that travel far and wide always tend to simplify with distance. It was the story of a ship so slow that nothing should have feared it, and so dangerous that everything eventually did. A ship that never chased, and never needed to. A ship that let its enemies come to it, patient and unhurried, the way a mountain waits for weather to wear it down, knowing that the weather will grow tired long before the mountain ever will. Somewhere in the vast, quiet dark between the stars, the Patience continued forward on its long, unhurried patrol, exactly as it always had, carrying its crew and its history and its hard-won reputation deeper into a galaxy that was slowly, one careful lesson at a time, learning to leave it alone. Roel Venn never forgot the 6 hours he spent watching the Patience drift through the dark, or the 11 seconds that ended Torv Hessig's life, or the strange, unwilling respect that had eventually replaced his fear, as the years went by and the full story of the Skarn engagement became public knowledge among his people. He left active flight duty a decade later, his ambitions never quite matching the reckless confidence that had carried other pilots of his generation into more celebrated careers, and took a position instead as an instructor at one of the Skarn fleet's newer training academies, the kind of quiet, steady posting that suited him far better than the cockpit ever had. He taught new cadets, year after year, the same lesson that Fleet Commander Vral had eventually built into official Skarn doctrine, following her withdrawal from the Patience engagement, that courage without patience was simply recklessness wearing a braver name, and that the difference between a fleet that survived a difficult encounter and a fleet that vanished entirely usually came down to whether its commanders had the discipline to study a threat honestly before deciding how to respond to it. Some of you will meet ships like the Patience someday, he told his classes, more than once, over the years. Not that exact ship, perhaps, but something built on the same philosophy. Slow, heavily defended, utterly unbothered by your speed or your aggression. When you do, I want you to remember that the smartest thing Fleet Commander Vral ever did in her long career was not finding a way past that ship's defenses. It was recognizing, honestly and without shame, the moment when continuing to search for one would have cost us more than we could ever hope to gain. David Achebe, the young intelligence analyst whose careful reports had first drawn Fleet Command's attention to the Skarn's unusual pattern of restraint, went on to build a long and quietly distinguished career within human fleet intelligence, eventually rising to oversee the entire perimeter division he had once served as a junior officer. He kept Elena Marsh's short note to him, the one that had told him he was looking to understand an enemy rather than simply defeat one, framed on the wall of his office for the rest of his working life, a small private reminder of the philosophy he tried to instill in every young analyst who came through his division afterward. Under his guidance, human intelligence doctrine gradually shifted to place greater emphasis on understanding the reasoning behind a rival species' behavior, rather than simply cataloging their capabilities and movements. It was, in its own quiet way, an extension of the same principle that had built the Patience in the first place, that patience, careful observation, and a genuine effort to understand an opponent usually produced better outcomes, in the long run, than speed and aggression ever could. 2 decades after the Skarn engagement, Elena Marsh finally retired from active command of the Patience, handing the ship over to a new captain she had personally trained and mentored for the better part of a decade, a careful, methodical officer named Daniel Okafor, who had joined the ship as a young lieutenant, not long after the events with the Skarn had concluded. She spent her final days aboard the ship, walking its long corridors slowly, remembering the young engineer she had once been, fitting armor plates into place that she could not see the other side of, building what she had once called a promise rather than a coffin. "Any final advice, Captain?" Okafor asked her, on the morning she finally departed the ship for the last time, bound for a quieter posting on a training world, where she intended to spend her remaining years teaching new officers the same doctrine that had guided her entire career. Elena Marsh thought for a long moment before answering, looking out at the same amber-lit control room where she had spent 2 decades of her life, watching threats come and go, watching young officers grow into steady, capable commanders, watching one patient, unhurried ship continue its long journey through a galaxy that had, slowly and carefully, learned to respect it. "Don't ever let them rush you," she said finally. "Not the enemy, and not your own fear. This ship was built on patience, and patience is the one thing that no amount of speed or aggression from anyone else can ever take away from you, as long as you remember to hold on to it." She left the bridge without looking back, confident, in the quiet way that had defined her entire career, that the ship, and the doctrine it represented, and the crew who carried both forward into an uncertain future, would remain exactly what it had always been: slow, unhurried, difficult to hurt, and utterly, permanently, patiently unafraid. The patience continued on, as it always had, and as it always would, carrying its long history forward into the dark, one careful, unhurried day at a time.